Alrighty, well, thank you all so much for having me. Very excited to be here and continue the great discussion. Before our broader panel, I thought it would be useful just to highlight some new recent work on the changing landscape of economic opportunity in the US. This is joint work with some co-authors here and other parts of the Opportunity Insights research team. So the starting point for this new paper is this set of results that was released about 10 years ago that actually Melissa just mentioned in her talk. So this was the initial Land of Opportunity study. Many of you might be familiar with these data already, but let me just say a brief word on how this is constructed. What we've done here is take data from around 20 million kids born in the US around 1980, linked them to their parents using dependent claiming on tax forms, and then mapped them back to the metro or rural area in which they grew up. What we're showing here is data for kids who in particular were born into low-income households. So by that, throughout today's talk, we're gonna focus on kids at the 25th percentile of the parent income distribution. And then we're mapping their own earnings in their mid-30s. So what you can see here is there's striking differences across the US in terms of economic outcomes for low-income kids based on the neighborhoods in which they grew up. You have parts of the rural or suburban upper Midwest, places like Dubuque, Iowa, where already by their mid-30s, kids are vastly out-earning their parents, whereas you contrast with parts of the southeastern US, a city like Charlotte, where kids are actually earning substantially less than their parents, which is fairly remarkable given the amount of economic growth we've had over this period. So with the initial release of these data, I think there was a lot of kind of on-the-ground excitement around this question of how can one change the landscape of economic opportunity. So just as one example of that, there was an effort in Charlotte, North Carolina, where they invested a ton of money in infrastructure, public-private partnerships, in strategies to boost economic mobility, focusing on hiring and more jobs for the local population. There was an effort that spawned out of this called Leading on Opportunity. And this is just one of many examples of similar efforts across the US. But while these were going on at our research team, we were also closely following the academic literature on these issues. And one fact that really came out of the data, in addition to what Melissa showed about the local importance of and culture around family formation, is there are many historical factors that are incredibly predictive of the patterns in the map. So this is just one example here from a demographer named Tor Berger, where on the left he's showing rates of slavery in the 1860 census, and on the right you're showing outcomes for low-income kids who grow up in those neighborhoods, the same as the map I began with. You can see that band of dark red places running from North Carolina down to Louisiana is very similar in the two maps. And there were other examples showing the historical factors that are predictive of this type of variation, which gave us a bit of pause in light of the excitement on the ground, because it's, in some sense unclear, is it really possible to make a dent on these issues if they're so historically ingrained? And that's what brought us to this new project around this question of changing opportunity. What makes this new work possible is not any dark magic. It's the simple fact that now 10 years have gone by. So we're able to effectively update the data from the initial study. The way we're going to do that is by comparing how outcomes for kids have changed. You can think about kind of Gen Xers to millennials, so kids born in the mid or late 70s to kids born in the early 90s. So when I'm talking about changes, it's going to be based on kids' birth years. So I want to start by replicating the map I began with, but with two kind of key changes. The first is this map here is focused on white kids born to low-income parents as opposed to the full population. And it's also going to be focused on the subset of white kids born in the year 1978. What you can see in the map is a pattern that looks very familiar to the one on the initial slide. The places in red where kids go on to have worse outcomes tend to be concentrated in parts of the industrial Midwest and the Southeast US. The places in blue tend to be concentrated in the Upper Plain states. What we're now able to do is effectively fast forward this map 15 years, okay? Importantly, when I do that, I'm going to hold fixed the scale on the bottom of the slide so that you can directly compare the outcomes across the two maps. And what we see in the data when we fast forward to kids born in 1992 is a really broad-based degradation in outcomes for white kids born to poorer parents. The way I kind of like to intuitively describe the pattern you're seeing in this map is that the places that already had relatively poor outcomes, so parts of southeastern Ohio and parts of the broader South in the US, those places were kind of at the bottom. There wasn't really anywhere to fall, and they stayed where they were. But it used to be, at least for white Americans, that the American dream was really kind of alive and well, if you will, in parts of the coast, parts of the Southwest. You can look at areas in Massachusetts and New Jersey. But what we now see for kids born in the 90s is those kids have the same exact outcomes as their peers growing up in southeastern Ohio, parts of the rural South, and so on. Okay. When we look at the data for Black kids born to low-income parents, the first thing to notice is the map is substantially sparser, reflecting the fact that there's not an adequate population of Black families in much of the US to map these statistics reliably. We've also changed the color scale for reasons I'll make clear in a moment, but now places with relatively worse outcomes are in purple, places with relatively better outcomes are in peach. When we fast forward this map 15 years, we effectively see the opposite of the pattern we saw for white Americans. So the places with relatively better outcomes stayed where they were, and the places with relatively worse outcomes effectively caught up, okay? Now, it's worth pointing out, so over this 15-year period, as outcomes have worsened a bit for white kids born to low-income parents, improved for Black kids born to low-income parents, there are still very large racial disparities, which is why we've mapped these things on two different scales, right? So you effectively, these are the maps at the later portion of the sample for kids born in 1992. You have effectively two non-overlapping distributions still, where the areas that offer the very best opportunities for low-income Black kids still have lower outcomes than the places that offer the very worst opportunities for low-income white kids. Inflation-adjusted dollars, yeah, thank you. Great, okay, so what I want to do now is just quickly summarize these changes at the national level by splitting the data into four mutually exclusive groups: Black and white kids born to low and high-income parents. So as we saw in the maps, there was an improvement in outcomes for Black kids born to low-income parents. At age 27, this amounts to about $1,400 per year, which is about 5 or 10% increase in household income. What I'll say is we expect these changes to be persistent over the life cycle because we also see similar patterns, not just in earnings, but in educational attainment, things like family formation, and so on. There's been a worsening in outcomes, so about $2,000 per year decline for white kids born to lower income parents. And so if you combine these two facts together, this gives you this picture where there's a pretty substantial decline in the race gap amongst low income kids between kids born in the mid-70s and the mid-90s. So actually in a relatively short 15-year period, given the kind of long-running, persistent nature of these disparities in the US, we've actually seen these gaps close by about 30%, from about $13,000 in real earnings down to about $9,500 over this period. When we look at the data for kids born to high-income parents, of which I haven't shown you any of this yet, what we actually see is that, if anything, white kids born to high-income parents have been doing slightly better over time. And so, as we'll get into, I'm sure, in many of the panels later today, these changes in economic mobility very much mirror other areas of society, for instance, politically, where you've seen these kind of growing class disparities alongside shrinking racial disparities. And so if you combine the data for white kids born to poor versus high-income parents, you see this growth in class disparities, the difference in outcomes between kids born to those two types of parents, that almost exactly mirrors the changes we see in terms of racial convergence over this period, okay? This kind of class polarization of economic opportunity is fairly unique to white kids. When you look at the data for Black kids born to high-income parents, you actually see a similar improvement in outcomes for those folks. So the story for Black Americans over this period is almost kind of a rising tide that lifts all boats, whereas for white kids, you've seen this degradation of outcomes at the bottom and this slight improvement in outcomes at the top of the distribution. Hence the title of this work being Growing Class Gaps and Shrinking Race Gaps. Okay, before concluding, I want to spend the remainder of the time focused on why we think these patterns have, why economic mobility has changed differentially for different race and class groups over this period. I want to start by addressing what might be natural set of explanations, especially for folks in this room, which is a set of family level factors. So maybe there's characteristics of families outside of income, things like wealth, education, marital rates, that explain why certain groups have been improving versus worsening over this period. So before someone throws a shoe at my head, that turns out not to really matter for these changes. But importantly, it's not because these factors are not important. It's because they didn't change differentially for these groups in a way that could coincide with the changes in outcomes. So one way to think about that is declines in two-parent family structure, as Melissa referenced, are no longer super racially polarized. You see similar declines amongst white low-income parents as well. And so it doesn't really explain why different groups have been on different trajectories. So even if you subset the data to kids who grow up in single or two-parent households and just look only within those buckets, you still see growing class gaps and shrinking race gaps, just as we saw in the national data. A second possible explanation is, well, maybe this has nothing to do with race and class, and it's all about place, in the sense that perhaps labor markets or economic outcomes, the economy at large, has worsened in areas where lower income white folks tend to live, and perhaps improved in areas where black families tend to live. And so then that manifests in these growing class gaps and shrinking race gaps, but it's fundamentally a story about how the economy is varying in a given place. We also see that that does not seem to really provide much predictive power. And the clearest way to see that in the data is we can actually look within very fine-grained definitions of neighborhoods. So kids who grow up on the same census tract, just within a mile or so of each other. And you see even within those smaller units, the same kind of growing class gaps and shrinking race gaps that we saw at the national level. What that leaves on the table is an explanation that fundamentally has to operate within place, but impact different race and class groups separately. And so in thinking about what type of explanation fits the bill, we found it helpful to turn to the work of the famous sociologist, William Julius Wilson, who in his famous 1996 book, When Work Disappears, which is really focused on the pernicious impacts of joblessness on a community, Wilson says many of today's problems, crime, family dissolution, welfare, low levels of organization, are fundamentally a consequence of the disappearance of work. And so as many of you will know, Wilson was really thinking about these ideas in the context of black families on the south side of Chicago in the 80s. What we're going to do is effectively bring these larger, more recent data to bear on Wilson's hypothesis and ask whether one can explain what's happened with different race and class groups based on the conditions, the joblessness, the conditions of what's going on in the prior generation in the areas in which kids grow up. To do that, I want to start with data at the county level here, where what we're showing on the y-axis is exactly this trend in outcomes between the 78 and 92 birth years for white kids born to low-income parents. On the x-axis, we're showing kind of the Wilson variable. How have employments evolved for low-income white parents in the prior generation in that place? And what you can see here is, I should say, rather than map data for each county, 3,000 dots, which would make this very messy, what we've done is group places together based on the change in employment rates in the prior generation. So the leftmost dot here is the 100 or so counties where employment rates decline most for low-income white parents. You can see a clear upward sloping series here. So this national decline in outcomes for low-income white kids is concentrated in the sets of communities where their parents are no longer working. If you draw your attention to the right-hand portion of the plot, what you can see is that things are relatively stable for low-income white children in the subset of areas where things have been stable in the prior generation. Of course, this is just a descriptive analysis, and we'll unpack this a bit more in a moment. When we look at the data for black kids born to low-income parents, you actually get almost exactly the same relationship in terms of slope. So both black and white kids do much better if they're growing up in environments where folks in the prior generation and their community are working at high rates. The clear difference here is the points are just shifted to the right. There's been a very different set of shocks and trends that have impacted black versus white parents over the period in which the study is focused on. Again, we can look at other groups. So for instance, white kids born to high-income parents. The data are a bit harder to show for black kids born to high-income parents because there's less spatial reliability. Those folks tend to be concentrated in a few metro areas in the US, but you still get a similar pattern when you look for those folks. But just with these three groups here, you can see you can almost fit a single line to the data. What that means from just a statistical or pure kind of correlation perspective is that you can fully explain why different race and class groups have changed differently in terms of economic mobility with this variable, which is what are the employment rates of their own community in the area in which they grew up, and how have those changed over this same period. So I want to emphasize two things about this result. The first is that we don't think this is entirely about your own parents, because if you focus on the set of kids whose parents have remained employed and their income hasn't changed, you see exactly the same relationship, suggesting that what's going on in your broader community is important for kids' outcomes. And the second point is, of course, as we think about what is along the x-axis of this plot here, in the places where employment has really worsened, where jobs have gone away, many things have likely changed about those communities. And so is it employment or is it some broader aspect of the community? I don't think by any means this paper is the final word on that. And one point that's key to emphasize is that you get exactly the same result if you were to look at changes in marriage rates over this period as changes in employment. That is, the places, for instance, for low-income white kids, where are the areas in the US where those kids are now doing worse? It's the subset of places where their parents are no longer getting married at the same rates as they used to. So this variable is clearly important in thinking about what has changed for different groups over this period, but why does it seem to matter? For that, I think it's useful to think about two types of explanations. One is that maybe it's just all about the labor market and access to jobs when you're an adult. So one could say, look, you're showing me that, in places in Southwest Ohio, when plants go away for low-income white parents, their kids do worse. You could say, yeah, that makes sense. Those kids were planning to work those same jobs. Those jobs are no longer available to those kids, and so they have worse outcomes as a result. So that's one explanation. A distinct explanation, what I think would be more consistent with Wilson's view of things, is that the labor market's important, of course, but it's really about the environment in which you grow up, in the sense that what's worse about the areas where employment rates have declined is something has changed about what it means to grow up in that place. It's not just that there's not access to good jobs when you age into the labor market, but your childhood might have changed in important ways in terms of mentors and who's around and funding for the schools and any myriad amount of things one can think about. So it's useful to test between these two because, of course, the first would motivate a set of interventions and fixes that's really focused on the labor market, whereas the second is going to be more, thinking about stuff like Ian is working on in terms of access to good schools and whatnot. So the first and simplest piece of evidence we have for the childhood environment piece is if you look at outcomes for kids prior to when they enter the labor market, so things like high school graduation rates and standardized test scores, you can clearly see worse outcomes for kids in areas where employment rates have declined for prior generations, suggesting that something has kind of gone off the rails before kids start to work. The second way to test between these explanations is to think about families who move to areas that are improving versus worsening with young versus older children. When I do that, I'm going to address directly some of the important points that Jim raised last night about these research designs, but I want to start by just showing the data, which is I'm going to replicate the result I was just showing you, but focused on a set of kids who move when they're young. And along the x-axis, we're going to have employment rates in the prior generation in the destination county, right? So if you move when you're 6, 7 years old, here we're focused on kids who move before they're 8 years old, you're going to spend a substantial portion of your childhood in that destination. And what you can see in the data is those kids clearly do better. The kids who are moving to the places that are improving, they do better so long as they spend a substantial portion of their childhood in that place. Again, this plot would look similar with marriage rates on the x-axis. If we instead look at kids who move later in childhood, you don't see a similar relationship. And we view this as evidence that the environment is really important, right? Because kids are only kind of converging to what is going on locally if they've actually spent a substantial portion of their childhood in that place. Of course, the logic underlying this type of test that Jim has pointed out is that you need to be able to compare these families who move early versus late to improving versus worsening areas. And so we've done a bunch of work in the academic paper to directly test that, including, for instance, looking at siblings who have large age gaps, right? So there you're effectively holding the family fixed, but because the kids are different ages, the younger kid is getting much more exposure to that destination place. And in this setting, we see very similar results. So I want to wrap up and move to the panel. I think for me, the most optimistic read of these data is that it really is possible to change opportunity in a relatively short time frame. And I think from these analyses in particular, there are a bunch of important takeaways, which I'll flash up here. But I also want to be really clear that we don't view these results as the be-all, end-all to this literature, in the sense that it's not really clear exactly what one should do to intervene in place. And I think Jim really framed this nicely last night, because the neighborhood is, of course, a composite of broader forces. And so thinking about what exactly is driving these changes, how to unpack that, and then motivate that as a way to think about intervening in place to improve economic opportunity is the real kind of key next step for this agenda, in my opinion. And to aid the field in doing that, we've actually released all of these data publicly on a website called opportunityatlas.org, where for every county in the US, you can look at how economic outcomes have changed by parental income, by race, and by gender between the 78 and 1992 birth cohorts. So with that, I will move to the panel. Thank you all very much.
Well, good morning. We'll move on to our panel in a minute. My name is Kevin Corinth. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI and the deputy director of our Center on Opportunity and Social Mobility. In a few minutes, we'll be having a panel discussion about some of the things we learned from Benny's presentation on the role of place and how we can improve neighborhoods to improve outcomes for especially Black children. We're first going to have a few slides from Harry Holzer. Harry is a professor of public policy at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's going to be talking about employment in particular, which is something that came out of Benny's presentation, sort of one way to improve neighborhoods, but also acknowledging some of the limits of improving neighborhoods and focusing on individual outcomes. So with that, turn it over to Harry, and then we'll move on to our panel discussion. Sure, that'd be great.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and very happy to be here to talk about these very important issues. I'm going to spend just a very little bit of time talking about place, and my two co-panelists know a lot more about this research. I'm mostly going to end up deferring to them. I'm going to pivot to something that has come up a lot already, both in Melissa's comments and Benny's, talk about employment issues, and especially employment issues for Black men, which seems to be a very key component, highly correlated at least, with the marriage issues, with the spatial issues, et cetera, and which is actually close to my heart. So just a few words about place. I mean, first of all, broadly, if you use residential segregation as a measure of to what extent are people separated, and there is a literature suggesting segregation can be causal in some outcomes. What are the broad trends? Well, basically, the progress has been very uneven. Racial segregation has been declining very consistently, small amounts every decade, but over 50 years quite a bit. But income segregation has grown, very consistent with Benny's comments about racial gaps narrowing, income gaps, class becoming more important over time. So that's for broad context. Secondly, I just summarized all the different literatures on which there's quite rigorous evidence on moving people. I'm not going to go through each one, and again, I'm going to defer more to my colleagues. There are lots of positive effects within those different programs. They're not all positive, and the magnitudes aren't always large. There is something there. I want to add one thing to this list. The cost of housing in America has largely been absent from a lot of these mobility conversations. It's simply become too expensive for poor people, working class people to move in many parts of the country, to move to some of those better neighborhoods because housing is prohibitively expensive. Why is housing so expensive? First and foremost, because of all the restrictive zoning that we do and other regulations. So to me, that we have to add that to any kind of policy discussion that involves mobility in place. So There are issues regarding place, and there is some positive evidence, but of course there are limits. How much you're going to get from improvements on that dimension. The magnitudes, again, aren't enormous. Many people are not going to move to these good areas. And as we've been hearing over and over again, there's a whole lot of both personal and family characteristics, separately from race, that are very important that have to be addressed too. So I want to focus on differences by race and gender, and just borrowing a few more facts from the Chetty work. If you look at black girls growing up in lower income families, and what are their rates of upward mobility over time, they are as good as those of white girls and Latino girls growing up in the same low income families. If you look at their personal educational attainment and their personal employment and earnings, there is significant progress for those women over time. However, their household incomes remain lower, and the key issue for why their household incomes remain lower is partly because of much lower marriage rates, as we heard about, and much worse outcomes among the young black men who are mostly their partners. We can't duck that issue anymore. Black men lag behind all other native-born groups, both on educational attainment and on employment rates. And of course, if you look at the BLS numbers on black male employment, they don't look great. But if anything, they dramatically understate the problem, because about 20% of the population is missing from those census and BLS samples. And in that 20%, the vast majority of these men are not working, at least in formal and regular employment. So Patrick Bayer and Kerwin Charles adjusted those numbers using a variety of other information to try to get a fuller look at the population. There's simply enormous differences in employment rates between black men and white men, as you can see in these numbers, especially by looking at people not working either at a point in time or at any time in the past year. And that's an issue we have to focus on. So I'm broadly going to talk about what I think need to be twin goals that work together: improving educational outcomes, not just attainment, but also achievement, as Rick and others have suggested in this work, as well as early work experience, because as soon as people turn 18, the gaps in employment start to dramatically increase very early on for young black boys versus whites and Latinos. And so this twin goal of better education, but also early work experience and employment, I think needs to be an important policy goal here. And I've listed K through 12 education, which others in the room know much more than I do about, is a very important. We know that both the cognitive and the non-cognitive skills that people pick up in those years are very important. How to improve those, I think there's some growing consensus that school funding matters, but the magnitudes are, again, not enormous. Teacher quality matters enormously for student achievement, and if there's an intervention that can do good work, reparative work, I think high-dosage tutoring, with a number of studies, Saga Education, Success for All, is a policy intervention that can really help. But beyond that, I want to talk about other pathways, other modes where both education and employment can be improved for black men, and indeed for other men and women growing up in these low-income families, starting with high-quality career and technical education. When I was growing up, voc ed was a joke, and it was considered very stigmatizing, and we tracked both by race and by class into those programs. Career and tech education, and especially certain models of it, have become much more higher quality, where people can make choices, and it doesn't necessarily preclude moving into higher education. The best known model is career academies, generated very strong outcomes. Another one called P-Tech, and there's increasing interest in these models that take people from grades 9 into community colleges through grades 14 into certificate programs that show a lot of promise. College, both 2-year and 4-year matter. I'm going to focus on 2-year college. And community colleges are really interesting because there's always this tension between the academic side of the house, mostly preparing people for transfer, versus the workforce education side, the certificate programs in business and healthcare and IT. And some of them have great labor market value, but we have to do more to improve completion rates and the labor market value of broadly what's being created. We can talk about how to do that. And finally, 2 other, I think, very promising interventions: sectoral training, where the workforce providers work hand in hand with regional employers looking for more particular skills. The evidence on the best sectoral training programs, they're not all great, but the best ones are very promising, and work-based learning. Apprenticeships, internships, there's a whole literature growing on that. Truth is, people are much more interested in training and schooling when they're getting paid to do it. And surprise, surprise, I mean, I'd much rather go through those models when they're getting paid, and I think we're starting to get more promising evidence on apprenticeship and these other models. But one more thing we have to talk about, crime and incarceration remains an issue for these populations. The numbers are much better now than they were in the 90s and the early 2000s, but they're still problematic. So this very much interacts. Once young men have been incarcerated, their employment rates dramatically suffer. So we have to talk a little bit about those interventions as well, and maybe there'll be more talk later about that. I just want to provide a few pieces of policy on that. Number one, putting more police on the streets reduces violent crime. Aaron Chalfin and his co-authors, I think, have shown that very convincingly, and especially if they engage in effective forms of policing, not stop and frisk, but community policing, focused deterrence, et cetera. And again, the negativity you get from the progressive community on those issues, to me, is disturbing, because the evidence is very clear. But prevention programs, I think, are promising as well. Summer youth employment programs have shown quite impressive abilities to reduce crime and incarceration, and other programs like Becoming a Man in Chicago, the READY program, appear to have a pretty successful track record as well. And then finally, other things we can do, abating vacant areas in poor communities, strengthening community institutions, all are showing some positive effects. So I'm going to stop there, and two broad takeaways. Number one, a range of policies can improve upward mobility. There's a role for place-based, but not an enormous role. And I think the most crucial need is to improve employment and earnings and the skills of young black men as a way of improving mobility broadly for that population. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks, Harry. We're now going to have a panel discussion. We'll have about 20 minutes for us to discuss really policy solutions that can get at take some of these insights from your presentations about the importance of neighborhoods, about the importance of work. What can we do to improve outcomes of neighborhoods, but ultimately individuals who are the ones we care about? And then we'll save 10 minutes at the end for engagement from the audience in terms of questions. So the thing that I really took away from both presentations is that work matters a ton. It matters for improving communities, which can have downstream effects on the people who live in them. It matters for black men especially, who are very substantial employment gaps. And so I kind of go back to, what can we do about it? I mean, there's so many problems where we don't know what policies work. We take Melissa's presentation from this morning. We don't really have the policy solutions to increase marriage. But when it comes to work, don't we know what works to improve employment? Actually, no one mentioned welfare reform in either presentation, which was a bit surprising to me, because in the 1990s, which is the tail end of the kids born in 1992, where we saw those black children seeing much improved mobility rates compared to white children who were very exposed, especially among those in single-parent families, to welfare reform. Isn't that potentially a solution? So in the 1990s, so just for those who are less aware, I pretty much feel like I talk about this every single day, but there was a lot of worry that when we imposed work requirements and cash welfare, we put on time limits, we expanded refundable tax credits that also rewarded work, which is a big part of the story, that we're going to have dire poverty, that you'd have single-parent families on the streets. And that's exactly the opposite of what happened. We saw substantial reductions in poverty at the same time that we saw enormous increases in employment among single moms, who are the ones most exposed to welfare reform. And that was 1990s, which is now, what, 30 so years ago. But now there are more discussions about what about able-bodied adults without kids who are not disabled? What about for the single parents who still could work more? And there's ongoing discussions in Congress in the last few days about expanding work requirements in Medicaid and SNAP programs. So I guess My question is to both of you, maybe first to Benny and then to Harry. So for Benny, to what extent is welfare reform maybe playing a role in some of the progress we're seeing for Black Americans? Then I'll come to Harry and ask, is that a solution maybe going forward for some of the populations that you've been looking at?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So I think it's worth also just at start clarifying how exactly we're thinking about interpreting that graph that shows that kids are doing worse in the areas where parents are working at lower rates, which is what we're saying there is that as a child, being exposed in the sense living more of your childhood in a place where the prior generation is working at lower rates seems to have an adverse pass-through to your own outcomes. But as folks might well intuit, there's many things that differ about environments that have low versus high rates of employment, including, for instance, marriage rates. And so I think we don't really attempt to isolate these different features because it's hard to think about a natural experiment that might shock one versus the other, though of course not impossible, and it would be interesting to pursue work on those lines. So whether that relationship is driven by work itself versus broader changes in the community, we don't know from our paper. There is ongoing work, so folks like Liz Ananad at Columbia have begun working on this question, looking at, for instance, kids growing up in areas that have been hit by manufacturing shocks and so on. It does seem like it could be important. My intuition, though, Kevin, is that in terms of why have employment rates for parents diverged in that particular way over this period, it's possible there is a role for a welfare reform, and based on the timing, I think you're right, things could line up. What I'd say, though, is that my sense is it's kind of an overdetermined problem. There were many different things that caused employment rates for Black and white low-income parents to diverge. Just to give you one kind of clear example is if you look at trends in mortality rates for those parents, so you of course can't be employed if you're not alive. There's been huge, shocking economists to point out these obvious logical facts. But if you look at changes in mortality rates, there's been about a 2 or 3 percentage point change in, against white low-income parents over this period. So a large part of that discrepancy in employment rates simply is coming from the direct effect of mortality. And so yes, I think there could be a role for welfare reform. One would need to look at that directly. To be clear, we don't have evidence on that in our paper, but I agree it's interesting with the timing.
Okay, then Harry, I'll let you kind of opine on that, and also kind of going forward too, especially is our kind of work requirements and work expectations a part of the package of solutions?
I think, so focusing on welfare reform first, I think there's no question that it helped improve the employment rates of less educated Black women, especially single moms. I think you can't deny that trend. I think Benny's also right that there were other things happening, like the expansion of the earned income tax credit, which were also important. I think the gains in upward mobility for this population were limited, at least partly because the single parent rate remained so high in that population. So there was a limit to how much the upward mobility could improve. But of course, Black men benefited not at all, really, from that phenomenon, right? So while the employment rates were improving for Black women, they did not for Black men. So you're not going to help that population at all. In terms of work requirements going forward, I don't work a lot in this area. My sense, and if you read some of the papers of Brookings by Lauren Bauer and Chloe East, they suggest that our attempts to put work requirements into Medicaid and SNAP have not been nearly as successful as it was with AFDC in improving work rates. Some people might quibble with how they analyze those numbers, but I'm much less sanguine that you'd get the big bump. You might get some bump. And of course, what we also see is a big decline in coverage among people who are working just because of the administrative problems. So I'm less optimistic about that. And like I said, very few of those programs help young Black men at all. So I still would focus on improving their employment prospects primarily.
I also want to add, I think it's useful conceptually to separate the impacts of the work requirements on the adults from the children, especially in light of some of the explanations Melissa highlighted towards the end of her talk, which is if you kind of choose just a quote-unquote stick method like that, it could lure parents into higher employment rates and have more persistent employment and so on. What is the impact of that going to be on their own kids, the kids in their community? I think the jury is out on that. In particular, obviously, there's a mechanical reduction in time you have to spend with your kid and so on. So I think thinking strategically about how to couple employment-based reforms with some of these other family, strengthening families in ways that really help folks raise kids is really going to be the key, as opposed to just focusing on one element alone.
Right. And I would argue sort of with the earned income tax credit, that's sort of the shining example of something that encouraged work, it got more resources into households, and has the strongest evidence in terms of improving kids' outcomes in the short run and in the long run when they become adults, which we don't see as much with some of the programs that don't encourage work. I'd like to get to some other buckets of policy, namely on the title of this panel, which is on can you really move, or can you move people to opportunity? This has kind of become somewhat an in vogue idea in maybe the last decade, based on some of the work that Benny, your team at Opportunity Insights has done, which is, one idea is to have these housing choice vouchers, which are tied to certain opportunity areas, and maybe that's a way to move people who are in lower opportunity neighborhoods to higher opportunity ones where they can have some of these positive gains. So I think there's some pushback, and I think Harry actually brought this up. When we think about sort of the general equilibrium effects of such a policy, I mean, are you both, one, is it affordable when you scale such a program up to all low-income families? Is it going to have effects on market rents in supply-constrained areas if you're just boosting demand without fixing the supply problem? And what's the reaction to current residents to this influx of new residents? So to what extent can we really move people to opportunity with more funding? Or what about some solutions like Harry mentioned with, what about just deregulation? So make it more easy to build, make it more affordable to live in these areas, go back to the pre-1980s era where people actually could move to places with higher wages, better opportunities for their kids. And is that a more sustainable way to move people to opportunity than to sort of do so with government-directed subsidies? Maybe I'll start with Harry this time and then let Benny chime in.
Well, again, on this literature, I will gladly defer to the two of you. But my sense is, it's interesting because the move to opportunity experiment was timed in the early 90s. So if you view those results as being very positive, and I think they are very positive, but what happens when you move kids under the age of 13, the housing market has just changed dramatically since then. And the costs now of moving people to good neighborhoods is so much more prohibitively higher than it was back then. It just makes me skeptical that you can move. I think there's a role for these policies to play. But I think so much more should be focused on, regardless of where people live, improving their access to good skill formation, and again, both more academic, cognitive, non-cognitive, as well as good employment, and trying to proliferate trying to scale up the successful models of things that improve people's earnings and early work experience. Mm-hmm. So if I had limited resources to bet, that's where I'd place my bet.
Yeah, Benny, your thoughts on that?
Look, I think that the evidence says you can definitely help individual families, quote unquote, move to opportunity. I think there's a lot of work to be done reforming the existing set of housing voucher programs before one thinks about expanding them, that both allows for more choice and helps families actually access neighborhoods and units where their kids have a shot to do well. At scale, is moving to opportunity a solution to improve economic mobility in the US? My view is obviously not. I think common sense kind of tells you that that is not a sensible path forward. What one clearly needs to do is learn from studies folks are doing about what it is about particular neighborhood environments that fosters mobility, and think about how we can replicate those elsewhere at scale. I think that's really the frontier for this agenda, not just shuffling people around to different places, because beyond the cost and challenges of implementing that, there's the GE effects of what might happen to the neighborhoods and housing demand and so on. So
to what extent is school choice a substitute towards moving people to opportunity? Even if we can't change their residence, if we think schools are an important way where kids learn social, cognitive, and non-cognitive skills, is that a way to work around some of these problems of place and ensuring kids have better access to schools? Maybe, Harry, that might be something you could speak to.
My reading of that literature is that pure voucher approaches have limited ability to improve outcomes. I mean, the results have been quite mixed across the different experiments. I think some of the charter schools charter school approaches have been remarkably successful. KIPP Academy being the first and foremost of those, but a number of others with different approaches. I think it's unfortunate that there's been some backsliding from interest in charter schools and that kinds of mobility across schools, certainly among folks in my party, the Democrats. So yeah, I would like to see that elevated, and particularly that model going back. We go back to those and see. And again, can you scale those in a way? You know, we know that in New Orleans we had the remarkable success of a charter-based model. Of course, Doug Harris and others who studied it down there then told you all the reasons why they were skeptical that that can happen elsewhere. They thought it was a sort of perfect storm of circumstances. But still, I think that model is something we've walked away from too early, and I think it's unfortunate.
Yeah, Benny, is that something you've seen in any of the data you've looked at in terms of like some of these neighborhoods that have seemed to be promoting upward mobility? Is there anything about the school ecosystem and more school choice that could be playing a role in any of these outcomes?
I think I agree with Harry's take. What I'd add is that if you take patterns of upward mobility by very granular definitions of neighborhood, what you can do is then look at how much variation there is within a school district, right? So one can say, if it was all about schools, what you would see is that there should be no differences in mobility by neighborhood for kids who attend the same school. What you see is that a lot of that variation actually persists within school. So my kind of short response to you, Kevin, would be it's an incomplete substitute. I think on the margin, more choice can be helpful in certain scenarios, as Harry outlined, but it is not going to knock out all of these differences we see across neighborhoods in terms of kids' outcomes.
Okay, yeah. And I want to get soon to the limits of place-based policy, because I think that's an important point that was made. But before we get to that, there are a lot of sort of explicit place-based policy, not just moving people to different neighborhoods, but what about these distressed neighborhoods that have been left behind, that have not seen any improvement for decades? What do we do about them? And there's a bunch of policies in the federal and state toolkit. We have opportunity zones, new markets tax credit, enterprise zones, enterprise communities, a long laundry list of tax incentives and other ways to promote either investment in these communities or spur employment in them. To what extent should we be focusing on these policies, probably not as a full solution, but can they play a role in improving these distressed communities that have been left behind, where people have been less willing to move? Is that an important part of the policy toolkit? Benny, and then here you go.
My view is the jury is still out, to be honest, in terms of I think we're beginning to understand when and in what circumstances those programs can boost employment rates for adults. I don't think we know much yet, though I'm happy to be corrected if folks know of studies I'm not aware of in terms of the impact that those programs have on the long run outcomes of kids. What I'll say is that my intuition is it's helpful to pair those programs with some type of social capital or social network type intervention. So one thing I didn't have time to get to in the data, but in general, when thinking about this relationship between kids' outcomes and employment rates in the prior generation, what you see is that it's not everybody in the prior generation who matters. It's the kids who you're most likely to actually be friends with socially. So for instance, it's the parents of kids in your own grade. One interesting feature of that is actually if you bring in data on interracial marriage rates, what you can see is that in communities with very high rates of white-black interracial marriage, the black children start to become sensitive to what's going on with the prospects of the white parents. And so I think in thinking about how to kind of intervene in distressed areas, perhaps some of these interventions can be useful for kids to the extent they boost opportunity for parents. But I think kind of trying to understand the social dynamics within these communities, especially understanding the fact that these different groups by race and class can be on completely different trajectories within the same place. And so in many ways, the kind of bucket of place, as folks have been talking about, could be too coarse for many of these types of problems.
I would largely agree with that. There have been a few, if you're talking about economic redevelopment of these really distressed neighborhoods, you have a few programs like empowerment zones and others, but I think we're far away from being able to say this is again an approach that can be scaled. So again, and our policy options are limited. I would try to improve the employment rates of the parents first, and then try to make this whole range of improvements in the schools that people go to, and really try to improve the access of the children in those schools to early employment opportunities wherever they are located. and maybe that package, I think, would be more successful than really trying to dramatically redevelop these areas.
And I like pulling on the thread of the early work opportunities. So as a follow-up to some of the research I showed, we've actually partnered with folks to visit some of the areas in the US and that have had the largest growth in class gaps and shrinking race gaps. So I actually got trained, I'm not sure successfully, to conduct qualitative interviews in those places. So you send the economist into your home. But so I was able to visit with a number of families, and this notion of early work experiences actually came up quite a bit in terms of shaping future prospects and notions of work and attitudes towards work. So I think that's a useful path for future research.
Yeah, and we'll get to questions in a couple of minutes here. But I think the last thing that I was really struck by in many of your slides, that despite the progress that we've seen for Black kids who grew up in 1992 versus in 1978, which was positive compared to for the white children, which was negative, there's still a huge gap, right, between even the distributions on those maps that you showed,
Yep.
or just that we've closed 27% of the gap, but there's still a lot left. And I think that speaks to probably the limits of place-based policies that Harry was alluding to. So I mean, if we think, can you give some sort of quantifiable number of the gap that we have between Black and white kids in terms of their lifelong outcomes? I mean, what share can we really close with sort of these policies that are focused on place as opposed to those that get to the individual outcomes? Here, are you willing to put out a number?
No. Yeah, no, I can't. Maybe, Benny, based on some of the Chetty work that you've been involved in, maybe you could come closer to
7.4. No.
That's a great number. What's the standard error on that?
0.82.
Yeah, so no, I can't. I just think that the broad themes are a role for place, certainly don't ignore it, but really focus on the education and employment and family. You know, that continues to matter enormously, and I'm 100% convinced by Melissa's work on that, and changing at least those messages that we send to kids is hugely important, I think.
Yeah, Benny, I guess as someone who's done research showing that place can matter, what would you say about that? I mean, how do you compare policies that focus on improving neighborhoods versus individual focused outcomes?
I think, both and, in the sense that I think you're right, Kevin, that to be skeptical of the kind of fully place-based approach, because one way to think of those two side-by-side maps on the different scales is that even if you manage to get all of the struggling areas for Black Americans up to the top place for Black Americans, you would still have disparities. So I think that tells you that there's kind of a bound to the place-based approach. Now, the question is whether doing the place-based approaches in even the places that have the good outcomes could help there too, So I think that is one way one can get around that. What I would say is that in terms of how to think about the magnitude of the convergence we've seen, and I want to emphasize this was a relatively short period, right? So it's just 15 years in the long arc of the time periods folks have been studying these disparities, is we were focused here on average earnings, so changes in racial disparities on average. You can get very different results, actually, if you look at what you would call quantiles of the distribution. So just to put that in plain language, if you were to take a measure of persistence of poverty, which is amongst Black and white kids born to parents, say, in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, what fraction of them stay poor, stay in the 20%, bottom 20% when they're adults? There's actually been racial convergence in that domain of about 75%. So there is much sharper convergence, whereas there's been very little progress at the top of the distribution. So what fraction of kids make it from the bottom quintile to the top quintile? So I think in addition to place versus individual focus, it's useful to think about kind of where in the distribution we've seen progress and where we haven't. Essentially, there's been, for Black Americans, a movement out of non-employment and into relatively stable, low-paying jobs. But you haven't seen a bunch of progress, in terms of reaching the upper middle class. And so I think that frame is useful in thinking about what to do moving forward.
Okay, great. I think we have 10 minutes left for questions. We have a microphone over there, so raise your hand, and then a microphone will be brought to you, and you can ask questions right in the back, and then we'll come up here, and then we'll go that way.
Thank you. So I think everything that you've been saying is absolutely important, marriage, education, opportunity, and so on. But I can't help feeling that we're missing something almost intangible. You mentioned, for instance, social capital, which I think is absolutely important, and your skepticism that we could solve this by moving, lots of people, which I would tend to agree with also. I also heard mention of the New Orleans and the charter system. So this question is coming from 12 years of living in a distressed community in New Orleans and seeing this charter system take over post-Katrina. And the sense I have is of what we're missing, and you can tell me if you agree or not, is that there can be a way of talking about people in poverty that kind of homogenizes them. And what I saw in this community over 12 years is that even though I'm trained as a sociologist, done work on poverty, is that there are a lot of distinctions between the quote unquote poor. They're just very different kinds of poor people who are poor for different reasons, even in the same community. And as I would work with, I started a nonprofit there, as I would work with individual families, go to their homes, I would give very different diagnoses for what was going to work for different families. And then the other thing that comes to mind is post-desegregation, the pulling out of the Black middle class and what that's done. And I don't hear a lot of people talk about that. And so part of the reason our family lived there was particularly because of some of the harms of this kind of hyper-segregation of poverty and the Black middle class not being there. And so we as Black middle class went there, we still have the house there. Of course, it was not a very easy place to live. But I guess my question is around everything that you're saying is absolutely true, but I have a hard time seeing us really move this without having that really kind of in there, living together, working on the bridging social capital across class. I'm thinking of Jeffrey Canada's work and what he did in the Harlem Children's Zone. I mean, he was just doing this excruciating work of going into homes, parent training, just excruciating work from the ground up before the children were born. And I think the policies are important, but how do we break past that? I'm also thinking of, I would bring in other women, say single parent women, to help me with my kids. And when they would see what I was doing in my house, the homeschooling we were doing, the kind of literature that we were reading, the lack of the television and the media on, I literally got comments like, I've never seen this way of doing things. And so I just have a hard time seeing us move the needle without some of that kind of, but I don't really have an answer for how that happens. And so I guess I'm just trying to figure out how do we marry the kind of macro level policies you're talking about with my sense of what is going on the ground level, and how are we going to just keep hitting a ceiling if we don't hit that?
Well, your comments are very compelling. There's no question that within what we might think of, say, as low-income or single-parent Black families, there's just a lot of heterogeneity. And some are much more attuned, some do have better social capital. And as you said, coming up with a policy to change that. The notion that when the Black middle class moved out of a lot of these neighborhoods, the class segregation went up. The institutions that supported these communities in the past weakened dramatically. I don't have a good answer on how to rebuild those institutions, although there is evidence that when money is invested in neighborhood institutions, community institutions, that does help the neighborhood and does improve outcomes. Trying to figure out how to get Black middle class people either to live there like you did, which I think is going to be challenging, but perhaps to have some involvement with those families and in those institutions maybe is promising. But from a policy point of view, I think we need a lot more inquiry along those lines, and then maybe policy after that.
I agree with Harry said. Maybe I'll keep it tight and leave room for other questions, but I'm happy to catch up offline. I have some thoughts as well.
Great. I think I saw a question up here, and we have 4 minutes.
This will be really quick. I'm not an economist, so I'm asking this question out of ignorance. So in the Wilson 1996 book, he mentioned spatial mismatch, right? So you have this disparity, like the skills are here. Sorry, the skilled jobs are here. The people live way over there. I'm wondering, in terms of the context of place, how do we address the spatial mismatch problem? We can train people to have great skills, but if the jobs are 10, 20 miles away, how does that help them if they don't have transportation, they have poor transportation, et cetera? How do we address the spatial mismatch problem?
So I used to work in that area many years ago, and my interest was piqued by William Julius Wilson, who had an enormous impact on my thinking back in those days. It's a bit about transportation and maybe childcare. It's more about information, social capital, the networks that connect people with the jobs that are further away. So making, I think, an attempt to plug people into employment networks relatively early, I think would help with that spatial barrier.
I share Harry's intuition. I'll just add, and I'm happy to share offline, there's a new work by David Card and co-authors that evaluates exactly this and shows that this has actually changed fairly substantially from when Wilson was writing. So actually today there's no longer any racial disparities in distance to good jobs, distance to centers of labor markets, and so on. So yeah.
I think Card et al. Might have overstated the progress.
That's
they were looking
Very
only
fair.
at geographic distance, not social
Not
distance.
social distance. That's
like
absolutely, yeah.
So.
All right, we'll move now to Howard.
I just want to build on, my eyes are not good enough to see your name card, so, Angel. So in the early 1900s, there was a movement to do exactly what you're talking about. It was called the settlement house movement. And people of middle-class backgrounds, Jane Addams, she won the Nobel Prize for this, settled in lower-income neighborhoods. And they provided music lessons and nutrition lessons, citizenship classes, English as a second language. There are, boys and girls clubs can do this kind of thing. We have to, I think, rediscover this model. And there is a very effective program in Shreveport, Louisiana called Shreveport Bossier Community Renewal. And middle-class black people are moving into the poorest neighborhoods in Shreveport and modeling exactly what you're doing. So I think the idea of clubs, recreation, just being exposed is so old-fashioned that we need to rediscover it.
I don't think there's a question there, but I agree.
All right. We have time for one last question. Yep, Robert Cherry.
I think there should be still some discussion of planned gentrification in these distressed cities. There's certainly examples that Warren Buffett has a group of places that have been very successful in planned gentrification. And I think it's important because all this discussion of moving people out basically says we're not really going to do, the priority is not to do anything about where people live, but get them out of there. That's what charter schools to some extent does. It says, forget about the public schools in some of they're hopeless. We got to get people into charter schools. I'm exaggerating, but so what do you think about energizing a little bit more of this planned gentrification?
It's interesting, and what it reminds me of, Robert, is when in the 80s and 90s when I lived in Michigan and worked in Michigan State, and I was actually a co-author of a book on Detroit, and Detroit was viewed as such a basket case. It's so hard on every single one of these dimensions, and yet a certain kind of gentrification has really led to some resurgence of Detroit. It was a very particular kind, and the progress hasn't reached a lot of the families who live there. But certainly it is an example of urban turnaround that we should be looking at and thinking more about. So it certainly, at a minimum, it merits some thinking and some research.
All right, well, that concludes our session. Let's give a hand to our panelists.